So what defines something as contemplative as opposed to not contemplative?
That's a really good question. I always think about it as when I'm introducing a puzzle like that to a group of kids, my state is really important. I want to be fully present. And when I say that, I mean I am sitting there, I'm fully present to what's going on. I'm not talking, I'm not thinking, I'm not distracted by other things. I'm completely there. And I'm drawing everybody else's attention to this in a way. So I'm in a way scaffolding this sense of presence and awareness focused on an object, basically. So in a way, you could also think about it as comparable to maybe sitting and looking at a symbol, or sitting and listening to a chant, or sitting and focusing on your breath. But in here, I'm focusing on a tool, a toy, or a puzzle with that same approach. And what I find is when I'm in that state of mind, I scaffold it for the students. They automatically click into it. It's almost like you're entraining it in a way. I don't know how else to describe it. But you feel this joint sense of presence and attention. And the kids learn that when you take something out like that, oh, this is a special time. This is a time when we get to see something new. We get to see this, because usually it's something really interesting and really exciting. And their attention is, Montessori used to call it capturing attention. So the teacher is scaffolding the process of helping them attend to this interesting thing.
So that's a type of practice that's really embedded throughout the curriculum, the Montessori curriculum, and calls for an entire classroom environment to make that happen and bring the student into that and encourage and empower them to take the work seriously. How do you transfer that kind of skill building that can be so successful in a Montessori environment into a different classroom environment? Is it possible?
Yeah, I think so. I think that same, I think the materials, the Montessori materials help facilitate that, because she was very skillful in thinking about how to make a didactic material, like a material that is self-teaching. She called those autodidactic materials, materials that children can learn, that teach themselves something through interacting with it. But I think any kind of content that you are exploring as a group, as a community of learners, can be approached with this same level of attention and focus. I think it takes some creativity to think about how you might do that, depending on the subject level and depending on the age of the kids, depending on the preparation of the kids. I think, ideally, it would really need to happen at a school level, so that when kids came into school, that was an expectation, something they learned early on, and that as they proceeded through the grades, they could build on it. Unfortunately today, one of the challenges of education is that there's a lot of mobility. So mobility of teachers, mobility of kids, mobility of administration. So every school year there's a new configuration of people, and kids have to get used to that, and teachers have to get used to that. Another advantage of Montessori is that the kids stay in the same class for 3 years. So they get to know one another, they get to know the teacher, and the community builds itself in a more stable way. With the constant changes that go on in schools today, that becomes more of a challenge. Although that's kind of the way society is today, so it's something we have to learn how to cope with. But I do really feel like that adult presence is really key. Because if you can have all these great activities and materials and ways of doing things, but if the adult doesn't have that contemplative presence, they're not going to be able to teach those kids. Because I think a large part of it is, like I said, scaffolding, creating the space for that, for the kids to experience it.
So I wanted to follow up with this issue about the types of contemplative lessons, or what does it mean to be contemplative in terms of the kind of learning that teachers are offering students. And when I think about my childhood and how I was educated from kindergarten through 12th grade, and I think about where were there contemplative moments there. Certainly no one ever used these words, meditation or contemplation. And I did do music for a long time, but I didn't find music contemplative at all, probably because I wasn't very good at it and I didn't like it very much. I suppose art in some ways could be a contemplative space where you're sitting there with a blank piece of paper or a piece of wood and so forth and trying to figure out how to bring something forth. But for the most part, I didn't really find my education to be very contemplative from K through 12. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more concretely, in a 3rd grade class, in an 8th grade class, what kinds of things are teachers doing now in classrooms that are different from that past, that you would really call quintessentially contemplative? And give us a sense of how that actually happens. What does the teacher say to the students? What do the students do? And how do students experience it?
Well, one example might be in language arts, and you're maybe studying poetry, and you're working on a particular poem. Rather than, just reading the poem and then asking the students to memorize it or analyze it or whatever, the first thing that you do is you ask them to just sit quietly and listen, and invite them, as they're listening, to pay attention to what's going on inside their body and how do you feel when I read this poem to you? What thoughts come into your mind when I read you this poem? Just be open to this experience of hearing this poem. So let's just sit quietly for a minute, get ready, prepare ourselves, and then I'm going to read. And then I'm going to read it again, maybe once, maybe twice. And then you're going to maybe take a moment and write, how did I feel when I heard this poem? What parts of my bodies did I notice? Did I notice tingling? Did I notice a feeling of sadness? Did I feel a longing? Poetry can, it can trigger a lot of different experiences. So the poem becomes something somatic instead of analytic or cognitive. So you can actually get a whole body experience of a poem. And I think when you do that with a group of students, it helps them understand the meaningfulness of poetry, and maybe perhaps could inspire them to write a poem about their own experience, or write a reflection on that poem. So that's one experience of the way maybe it could be used in language arts. Another way, often there's some social emotional learning programs that use literature to help kids understand social emotional dimensions of people's lives and experience. For example, they'll introduce a character and they'll ask you to understand what's going on in this character's mind. How is this character thinking? Well, rather than just do that analytically, you could do that with a whole. I see the contemplative as bringing more dimensionality to any experience. So, for example, you could read a story and you could say, okay, well, how does this character feel? Well, rather than doing that, you say, imagine yourself as that character. Take a moment. Just put yourself in that character's place. How do you feel? Really, what's going on for you? What do you want to do? And this is before you read the whole thing, and see whether your fuller experience of that character or empathy for that character helps you understand the whole story better. And in doing that, not only are you giving students a deeper ability to comprehend the literature in a really deep way and to analyze it in a really deep way, but you're also providing them with an understanding of how they might write something, why we might feel like writing something. So it not only helps with the interpretation, understanding, but also in the creative process as well. So rather than the learning being kind of superficial, it becomes multidimensional. That's kind of how I think about it. One way I used to teach, I used to love to teach biology when I was a teacher. I was very interested in teaching about animals. Kids love animals, and they love to learn about animals. One of the first lessons I used to do in biology was around fish. And rather than starting to talk about fish and where they live and fish have gills, fish do this, fish do that, whatever, I would bring in a fish in a fishbowl, and we would sit and contemplate the fish for a little while. Sometimes I would play some music that might have sort of a water theme to it, and just have them sit and watch the fish, and then hear their reflections about the fish. What What comes to their mind when they look at the fish?
How about ways of fostering compassion or care within kids in an elementary school?
In the social emotional learning curriculum, there are a lot of ways to help students do that. One of the ways, like for example, Mark Greenberg, who is one of my colleagues at Penn State, developed this program called PATHS, which is Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies. And in his program, one of the things he teaches kids is to learn how to identify other people's emotions, their own emotions and other people's emotions, so that they can be empathetic. If you don't understand that a sad mouth, a frown, means that somebody's sad, if you don't know that, then it's hard to be empathetic. And so they have some curriculum around that. Another thing that's, I think, very contemplative about Mark's social emotional learning program is this activity he calls Turtle. He has, and this is actually taught for the preschool and kindergarten kids, he has a story about this wise turtle who's helping a turtle that's having problems. And this child turtle who's having problems is having a hard time controlling himself, and he's losing friends because he's not understanding other people's needs, and he's causing trouble. And the old wise turtle tells him that he has this tool that he can use whenever he needs to stop himself, and it's this shell. And so he goes into his shell like this, and that's a way to calm down and take a moment and think about what's happening. This is why he calls it alternative thinking strategies, to stop, take a moment, think about what's happening, think about the other people's needs, and then come out of your shell and deal with what you have to deal with. So the kids are taught something called doing turtle. And so when they're having trouble, they can just stop and do turtle, which just is doing that. So, that's an example of how a social emotional, and Mark created that program long before we all started talking about contemplation and education, although he was thinking about that because he is a contemplative practitioner. But that's one way that then the kids are taught, okay, now think about how the other person might feel in this situation and how you might resolve this issue in a way that might serve both of your needs, instead of trying to get them to do what you want them to do. Or so that's one example. The other, in social emotional learning, there's a lot of activities to build community, to help the kids feel like they're part of a community. There's a very strong motive among human beings to feel like we want to contribute to our community, to make valuable contributions to our community. So setting up systems whereby kids feel like they have a role, they have a place in that, jobs to do, responsibilities, and then acknowledgement for those responsibilities. Another thing that I've seen that in the social emotional learning curriculum is something called a peace corner. It's a corner of the classroom that is set up for kids to go when they feel they need time out for themselves. They need to calm down. Maybe they're sad, maybe they're dealing with a stressful situation, and just having a child be in the peace corner often elicits compassion from other kids, because if you're over there, it's clear that you might need some support. And so kids will come over and help one another, or ask them, do you need anything? Or sometimes kids go into those places because they're having really serious problems. Somebody in their family died. And it's a way for teachers to learn about these things, because often teachers don't know what's going on at home with kids. And if there's a peace corner, and the kids understand how to use it, it helps everybody in the community understand that sometimes we need special help. Sometimes we need a place to be where we can be quiet, and sometimes we might need help from other people. There was one other thing I was thinking of before I talked about Peace Corner. Resolving conflicts. Schools have developed ways to help kids learn certain processes or procedures for dealing with conflict resolution. So another thing about social emotional learning programs is they have a procedure, basically, that involves steps that you take when you are having conflict. So they're teaching a process by which you understand another person's needs, and you can resolve whatever the conflict is around that. So that's another And that, I think that is one area where the social emotional learning curriculum really, they do have activities that I think teach the actual ability, and it's not just telling them, but it's actually practicing, because there are practices for conflict resolution and things like that.
So would you call those practices contemplative?
I think it probably depends on how they're being used. An example of the misuse of some of these activities is, I know I've heard that sometimes teachers use turtle in a way that's not appropriate. For example, a child's having trouble and they say, go do turtle, and you tell somebody like that to go to turtle.
Turtle now.
Yeah, right. Then I don't think that's very contemplative. But if you say to them, I can see that you're really upset. Do you have any ideas about ways you might help yourself calm down? Is there anything you've learned lately that might help you? And then you're eliciting the ability to think, well, maybe I should do turtle, instead of do turtle. It's like I can see one of the concerns I've had about teachers using contemplative practices in schools is using them to be punitive. Like, all of you sit still and take 3 breaths right now because you need to calm down. Instead of, let's all calm down together, because I can see that we're not doing what we need to do right now. So let's just take a moment and all calm down. So I think that's why I keep saying, I think a lot of it has to do with the teacher's presence, because you can do one thing in a contemplative way or not. It's really the approach by which you do the thing.